They say grief is love with nowhere to go. But at 3 a.m. in a house built for a family that no longer exists, grief feels a lot less like love and a lot more like a slow suffocation. The silence in my Victorian home on the north side of Chicago is heavy enough to crush a man. I am Elias Thorne. I am 74 years old. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, calculating load-bearing capacities and stress fractures for high-rises and suspension bridges. I know exactly how much weight a beam can take before it snaps. But as I sat in my wing-back chair in the dark, clutching a glass of scotch that had gone warm an hour ago, I realized I didn't know the breaking point of my own soul. My wife, Eleanor, died 8 months ago. Since then, I have become an island. The dust motes dancing in the moonlight are my only company. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer is the only conversation I have. I suffer from insomnia. It's a cruel affliction for an old man, to be exhausted in your bones but have a mind that refuses to shut down. I spend my nights haunting these hallways, checking locks I've already checked, staring at photos of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. Then the phone rang. It wasn't a soft digital trill. It was the mechanical, jarring scream of the old rotary landline I kept on the hallway table. It cut through the silence like a shriek. I froze. My heart hammered an erratic rhythm against my ribs. Who calls at 3 a.m.? The hospital? The police? A wrong number? My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. The plastic felt cold and heavy. I rasped, my voice thick with disuse. The voice on the other end was a whisper, but it was urgent, clipped, and terrified. I recognized it immediately. It was Frank, my neighbor from across the street. Frank is an ex-Marine, a man who survived Khe-Sanh and 2 divorces. He spends his nights chain-smoking on his porch, watching the neighborhood with the paranoid vigilance of a man who never fully came home from the war. He doesn't scare easily, but tonight he sounded petrified. "Frank?" I asked. "Listen to me carefully, Elias," Frank hissed. "Do not turn on the lights. Do not say my name loud." I asked, confusion clouding my sleep-deprived brain. "Your son is there," Frank said. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Jason? He lives 3 hours away. He hasn't been here in months. Frank, if my boy is here, he must be in trouble." Frank's whisper turned into a growl. "Elias, listen to me. He isn't alone. There's another man with him, a big guy. And Jason, he isn't knocking, Elias." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "Taping over the camera?" "Go to the door," Frank instructed, his voice shaking slightly. "But stay low. Look through the peephole." The line went dead. I stood there in the dark hallway, the receiver buzzing in my hand before I placed it back on the cradle. My legs felt like lead. Jason? My Jason? The boy I taught to fish on Lake Michigan? The boy whose tuition I paid even when times were lean? He had asked for a loan 3 months ago, $50,000 for a business venture I knew was a scam. I had refused. He had screamed at me, told me I was a selfish old miser, and stormed out. We hadn't spoken since. Why was he here in the middle of the night? I moved toward the foyer. I know this house better than I know my own body. I know which floorboards creak and which ones are silent. I moved like a ghost, stepping on the edges of the Persian rug, avoiding the loose board near the coat rack. I approached the heavy oak door. Eleanor had loved this door. She said it made us feel safe. I held my breath. I leaned forward, pressing my eye to the cold brass of the peephole. The glass distorted the world outside, bending the light, but the image was clear enough to stop my heart. Jason was standing under the flickering yellow light of the porch. He looked older than I remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting back and forth with a manic energy. He was wearing dark clothes, sweating despite the autumn chill. But Frank was right. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man I didn't recognize. He was huge, a hulking silhouette in a leather jacket, carrying a black medical bag. He looked like a butcher dressed for a funeral. But it was what was in Jason's hands that made my blood freeze in my veins. He wasn't holding a gift. He wasn't holding a key. He wasn't holding a peace offering. My son was holding a pair of heavy-duty industrial bolt cutters. And hanging from his wrist like a bracelet of intent was a thick roll of silver duct tape. I stood there, separated from my own flesh and blood by 2 inches of oak and a brass lock. And I realized with a sickening clarity that the boy I held when he scraped his knees, the boy I carried on my shoulders at the zoo, had come here to dismantle me. He hadn't come to visit his father. He had come to liquidate an asset. If you believe that family is supposed to be a slaughterhouse and not a splatter without realizing that blood can also be spilled, then you need to listen to what happened next. If you have ever had to protect yourself from the people you love, take a moment to subscribe. And tell me in the comments below, when was the exact moment you realized your child was a stranger? Because for me, it was right then, looking through a piece of glass at 3 a.m. I pulled back from the peephole, tears streaming down my face in the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fling the door open and demand to know why. But the engineer in me took over. The part of me that deals with structural failure recognized that the foundation of my life had just collapsed. I needed to assess the damage. I needed to gather data. I leaned my ear against the cold wood of the door. "He's old, Jason," the stranger muttered. His voice was deep, gravelly, the voice of a man who has done this before. One hit to the head. We drag him to the bottom of the stairs. We say he fell. The dementia defense works every time. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. The dementia defense. They were going to kill me and write it off as the clumsiness of a senile old man. I know, Jason whispered. I could hear the tremor in his voice. For a second, a foolish, desperate second, I hoped for redemption. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that my son would turn around. I prayed he would throw the bolt cutters into the bushes and run away. "Just make it look clean," Jason whispered. The hope died. It didn't just die. It was murdered by his next words. "I need that insurance money by Monday, Vane," Jason hissed. "The debts are killing me. The guys in Vegas aren't going to wait another week. If he doesn't sign the power of attorney tonight, or if he wakes up and fights." "The hard way is messy," the stranger, Vane, grunted. "Better if he signs. Is he heavy?" "He's frail," Jason said. "He's just a lonely old man." The betrayal was total. It wasn't just theft. It wasn't just greed. It was an erasure of my entire existence. To them, I wasn't a person. I wasn't a father. I was an obstacle. I was a check waiting to be cashed. Jason reached out. I saw the handle turn slowly. The lock held. I had double-bolted it out of habit, a relic of my insomnia. The deadbolt didn't budge. "Damn it," Jason cursed softly. He locked the top bolt. "You said this would be easy," Vane growled. "I'm not breaking down a solid oak door in a quiet neighborhood." "He's paranoid," Jason said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Look, we can't force it now," Vane asked, shifting the weight of the bolt cutters. Jason checked his watch. He looked up at the house, his eyes scanning the dark windows. He looked right at the spot where I was standing, though he couldn't see me. "We come back at dawn," Jason whispered. 8 a.m. I'll call him. Tell him I'm in town. Tell him I brought breakfast. He'll open the door for me. When he opens the door, you rush him. Needle first." They turned and walked away. I listened to their footsteps fading down the concrete path. I heard a car door close softly down the block, and the sound of an engine turning over. I didn't move until the sound was gone. Then my legs gave out. I slid down the doorframe. the rough wood scraping against my back until I hit the cold floor. I pulled my knees to my chest. I clutched my shirt, gasping for air, feeling like my heart was trying to tear itself out of my chest. The flashbacks hit me then. Not memories of Jason, but older, darker memories. The jungle, the feeling of being hunted. The PTSD from my time in the service flared up, mixing with the fresh, jagged wound of parental heartbreak. I shook violently, my teeth chattering in the silence of the foyer. He's frail. He's just a lonely old man. Is that what I was? I sat there for hours. I watched the moonlight shift across the floorboards. I watched the darkness slowly turn to gray as the sun began to threaten the horizon. I didn't drink the scotch. I didn't call the police. Not yet. If I called the police now, Jason would say he was checking on me. He would say he brought a locksmith because he was worried. He would gaslight me. He would gaslight them. And then he would come back another night, and I wouldn't be so lucky. No. I needed more. As the first rays of morning light hit the stained glass window above the door, casting a blood-red pattern onto the floor, the shaking stopped. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but the fear was gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating anger. I stood up. My knees creaked, but they held. I walked to the mirror in the hallway. I looked at the man staring back. I looked old. I looked tired. I looked frail. Good. Let them think that. Jason was coming back at 8 a.m. He was coming with donuts and a death sentence. He was coming to kill his father because he owed money to bad men. He thought he was walking into the home of a helpless, senile victim. He forgot one thing. I am a structural engineer. I know how to calculate stress. I know how to identify weak points. And most importantly, I built this house. Every beam, every bolt, every lock. I turned away from the mirror and walked toward the kitchen. I had 3 hours to prepare. I had 3 hours to turn my home into a trap. He forgot that before I was an old man, I was a soldier, and I know how to defend my perimeter. Let them come for breakfast. I'll be ready to serve them. The sun rose gray and unforgiving over Chicago, casting a pallid light that offered no warmth, only illumination. I hadn't slept, not for a single second, but the frantic trembling that had seized my hands at 3 a.m. had finally ceased. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical precision, the mindset of the engineer I used to be. For 40 years, I dealt in load-bearing walls and stress fractures. I calculated how much pressure a structure could take before it collapsed. Last night, looking through that peephole, I thought I had reached my limit. I thought I would crumble. But as the light crept across the floorboards of the house I built, I realized I wasn't collapsing. I was reinforcing. I knew Jason would return at 8 a.m. My son was a creature of habit, even in his treachery. I spent the hours between darkness and dawn not grieving, but preparing the site for demolition. At 6:30 a.m., the sound came. It wasn't a knock. It was the rhythmic scratching of a fingernail against the back door screen, 3 times in quick succession. It was the signal Frank and I had used for 20 years when we wanted to share a beer without alerting our wives. I unlocked the back door. Frank stepped into the kitchen, smelling of stale tobacco and cold morning air. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my face, seeing the hollowed-out shell of his friend, and he didn't offer pity. He offered ammunition. He reached into his pocket and placed a small silver USB drive on the granite countertop. "Dash cam footage," Frank said, his voice gravelly, like stones grinding together in a mixer. I pulled the SD card from my truck. "I got audio too, Elias. I have a high-gain microphone installed on my porch for security. It picked up everything, every whisper, every threat. I looked at the small drive. It looked so insignificant, yet it contained the proof of my own flesh and blood conspiring to end me. I asked. "Crystal," Frank said, "it's admissible, Elias. It proves intent, premeditation." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Jason had eaten his cereal before school for 12 years. I poured 2 cups of black coffee. My hands were steady now. The engineer had taken over. "He's bringing a fake doctor," Frank explained, blowing steam off his mug. "I ran the plates on the sedan they were driving last night. It's registered to a Marcus Vane, disgraced paramedic. Lost his license 5 years ago for stealing fentanyl from the ambulance stock. Now, he's a ghoul for hire. They use him to sedate seniors so the kids can get signatures on wills or power of attorney documents. It's a racket, Elias." "I know," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning deep in my gut. "They're coming back to finish it." Frank leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "We can call the cops right now. We have the tape." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray morning. "No, if we call them now, it's just conspiracy. It's words in the dark. Jason is charming. He's manipulative. He'll tell the police he was just venting, or that he was checking on me because he was worried. He'll gaslight them just like he gaslights me. He'll say I'm senile and imagining things. I need him to commit, Frank. I need him to show his hand in the light of day." Frank studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Understood." We spent the next hour setting the stage. I unlocked the front door, leaving the deadbolt disengaged, an invitation to the predator. I went to the safe in my study and retrieved a document, my old will, drafted 10 years ago. I placed it prominently on a coffee table in the living room, a piece of cheese for the rat. Then came the eyes. I took 3 small wireless cameras I used for security monitoring. I placed one inside the housing of the grandfather clock in the foyer, angling it to catch the front door. I placed a second on the bookshelf, nestled between volumes of encyclopedias, pointing directly at my armchair. The third I placed in the crystal flower vase Eleanor had loved so much. It felt like a violation to use her things for this, but I knew she would have wanted me to fight. "The angles are good," Frank said, checking the feed on his phone. "I'll be in the pantry." I asked. Frank patted the heavy wooden Louisville slugger leaning against the counter. "And the phone, ready to dial 911. "Good," I said. Frank disappeared into the pantry, leaving the door cracked just an inch. I sat in my armchair. I waited. The grandfather clock ticked. Tick, tock, counting down the seconds of my son's life as a free man. At 8:05 a.m., the doorbell rang. It was a cheerful sound, ding-dong, a sound that announced guests, friends, family. I stood up. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump. I shuffled my feet. I forced a trimmer into my hands. I walked to the door and opened it. Jason stood there. He was smiling. It was a bright, white, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He held a pink box from the local bakery. He was alone on the porch, but I knew Vane was waiting in the car down the street, waiting for the signal that the old man was compliant. Jason beamed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Surprise! I was in the neighborhood for a meeting and thought I'd bring you breakfast." I looked at him. I looked for the toddler I had carried. I looked for the boy I had taught to drive. I saw only a stranger wearing my son's face. "Come in, son," I said, my voice rasping. I stepped back, exposing my neck, exposing my frailty. I played the part of the confused, lonely old man to perfection. Jason stepped inside, the scent of sugar and cologne filling the foyer.
His eyes didn't look at me. They scanned the room immediately. He looked for the alarm panel. It was green, disarmed. He smiled wider. He walked into the living room and set the donuts down on the coffee table. His eyes locked onto the will I had left there. I saw the greed flash across his face, naked and ugly, a hunger that couldn't be hidden. "Dad, you look tired," he said, turning to me with furrowed brows. "You look exhausted." "It is hard," I mumbled, sinking into my armchair and gripping the armrests. "I get confused, Jason." "I know, Dad, I know," Jason cooed, stepping closer. "You know, I've been worried about you. You're alone in this big house. It's a lot to manage. Maybe—" "I don't know," I said, looking at the floor. Jason pulled out his phone. His thumbs moved quickly. "I actually brought a friend with me, a specialist. He was in the car. I wanted him to just take a quick look at you, give you a checkup, just to be safe." He hit send. "A specialist?" I asked, feigning fear. "A specialist," Jason corrected. "He's great." The front door opened. He hadn't locked it. Marcus Vane entered, a minute later. He was wearing generic blue scrubs that looked too tight across his chest, carrying the black medical bag I had seen through the peephole. He walked with a heavy, predatory grace. "Mr. Thorne," Vane said, his voice oily and deep. "I'm Dr. Thorne." "I haven't fallen," I said, allowing my voice to harden just slightly. "Confusion, then," Vane said, closing the distance. He set the bag down on the coffee table, right next to the donuts.
He unzipped it. "Memory lapses." "He wanders, Doctor," Jason added, moving behind my chair. "I see," Vane said. He reached into the bag. He didn't pull out a stethoscope. He didn't pull out a blood pressure cuff. He pulled out a syringe, preloaded with a clear liquid. "This will help you relax, Dad," Jason said. I felt his hands land on my shoulders. They were heavy. They pinned me down. "Just a little pinprick, and then we can look at some papers to make you safe." The sight of the needle brought a primal fear, but I forced it down. I needed the confession. I needed the moment to be absolute. "Wait," I said, looking up at Jason. I craned my neck to look him in the eye. "Jason, before you do this, do you remember the bike I built you? The red one?" Jason blinked, annoyed by the interruption. "What?" "We spent 3 weeks in the garage," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. "I painted it myself. You said it was the best day of your life." "I don't have time for this," Jason snapped, his grip tightening on my shoulders until it hurt. "Do it, Vane." "I remember," I said, my voice dropping. The tremor vanished. The slur vanished. I spoke with the cold clarity of a judge passing a sentence. "I remember everything, Jason." Jason froze. His hands went slack on my shoulders. I picked up the remote control from the side table. I pointed it at the television and pressed play. The screen flared to life. It showed the grainy, black and white footage from Frank's porch camera. It showed Jason and Vane standing in the dark. And then the audio filled the room, loud and distorted, but undeniable. One hit to the head. We say he fell down the stairs. The dementia defense works every time. Jason's face drained of color. He looked at the TV. He looked at the camera hidden in the clock. He looked at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Do it," he whispered, the words sounding like a curse. "You aren't my son," I said, standing up. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't frail. I stood at my full height, towering over the coffee table. Vane realized the game was up. He snarled, dropping the pretense. He raised the syringe like a dagger. "Jason!" he yelled at Jason. Vane lunged across the table, but the pantry door flew open with a crash that shook the walls. Frank stepped out. He didn't look like an old man. He looked like a Marine clearing a room. He held the Louisville slugger ready. "Ta!" Frank growled, his voice booming like a cannon shot. Vane froze. He looked at the bat. He looked at the wild look in Frank's eyes. He dropped the syringe. It clattered onto the hardwood floor, rolling toward the wheel. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Frank had dialed the emergency line the moment Vane had produced the needle. The sound grew louder, closer, a cacophony of justice screaming toward us. Jason collapsed onto the sofa. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He put his head in his hands and began to sob. But I knew the sound. He wasn't crying for me.
He wasn't crying for the betrayal. He was crying because he had lost. He was crying for himself. I stood over him, looking down at the top of his head, at the thinning hair that matched my own. I looked at the man who would have killed me for a signature. I felt a severance, sharp and clean, like a cord being cut. The police arrived in force. They dragged them out in handcuffs. Vane cursed and spat. Jason was silent, unable to meet my eyes as they led him past me. The entire neighborhood was watching from their lawns. They saw the squad cars. They saw the good son being shoved into the back of a cruiser. I stood on the porch, the same porch where they had plotted my death only hours before. I watched the squad car drive away, carrying the last remnants of my family. Frank walked out and stood beside me. He didn't say a word. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "It's over, Elias," he said softly. I looked at the empty street. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist. My heart was broken, yes. The grief for the son I thought I had was immense, a crater in the center of my life. But as I turned and looked at my house, my fortress, my legacy, the structure that had held firm when the enemy tried to breach the walls, I felt a strange, quiet peace. I had survived. I had purged the rot. The silence in the house wasn't oppressive anymore. It was clean. I turned back inside and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt home with a satisfying click, finally safe in the silence.